Before you can get going, you really got to understand how to stroke. Hey everybody, today we are continuing my series, Watercolor for Noobs. This is an opportunity for you to learn how to watercolor without being intimidated by all of the shit that's out there already. I'm not a professional watercolorist, I just do it for fun and as a hobby, and I'm trying to give you some tips that have helped me along the way. Today we're going to be talking about some basic techniques that will help you get started in learning how to control the water and control the paint, which are the two important things to do when you're watercoloring. The number one piece of advice I'm going to give you is that the paint is going to go where the water goes, so keep that in mind whenever you're doing any watercoloring, and that will help you along the way. We're going to start with washes, which are kind of the most basic watercolor stroke that there is, and it's like smallest essence. It is just putting a thin layer of watercolor down on the paper. Most often washes are used as backgrounds, and in our next episode I'm going to be giving you some simple backgrounds to work on to start watercoloring. The first kind of wash we're going to talk about is flat washes. Now, flat wash is a wash of color that is one color and it is even. To do a flat wash, you take your flat brush, you load it up with water, you load it up with paint. You go and you paint it on the page in like smooth motions next to each other so that you build out this smooth single color without any like gradation or anything like that. Now, if you have to go and work the paint and move it around a little bit to make sure that it all gets nice and smooth, no big deal. And if you find yourself with a patch of where there's a lot of extra paint and water kind of sitting in one spot, then just take a clean brush that's a little bit wet and kind of use it to sop up some of the paint. Your second wash to learn is gradient wash. Now, this is a wash where it goes from dark to light. What you're going to start with is loading up your brush with paint and water and then going and laying down a couple of strokes with that highest intensity color. Then you're going to go get some more water on your brush without cleaning it off. Just get a little bit more water from your water cup and lay that next to it so that the paint starts bleeding into the water. Go get a little bit more water, do the same thing, and keep doing the same thing. And by the end of it, you're going to find that you have a wash that is dark on one end and gets lighter as you go down. P.S. If you're having any questions about the supplies to use or the water or any of those things, I did my first episode of Watercolor for Noobs. I'll link it up here in the internet, Ethernet, ethos universe up ahead. Go ahead and click that and that will take you to the other video where we talk about paints, water, brushes, all the things. Watercolor is a transparent medium. Due to that, we're going to be talking about the next couple of things to look at, and one of that is working light to dark. Now, in traditional watercolor painting, the white in the painting is the white of the paper. That may be hard to do, and you can get things like wash or bleed-proof white to help add white to your paintings later. But when you're working with watercolor, it is really important to start with the lightest colors and then add deeper shades as you work. The reason being is that because it is so transparent, if you put dark down and then light on top of it, you're not going to be able to see the parts where the light is on top of it very well. Now, you can mess with that if you want to. Rules are made to be broken. However, the rule of thumb when you're working with watercolor is to start with the lightest, most desaturated shades, and then as you work your way up, get darker. Don't start with the dark unless it's going to be a dark-ass motherfucking painting. With watercolor, generally speaking, unless you're working with really concentrated paint, it's not going to be opaque and you're going to get to see through it, and that can be really fun to play with. The second thing we're going to talk about is saturation of color. More water means lighter, thinner color. You want to get to know how water interacts with your paint. This is really important when you're working with them, especially if you only went and bought a few colors. If you're going to do that, my suggestion would be buy the darker shades rather than the lighter shades, because you can always take a darker shade and make it a little bit lighter by adding more water. Start with a lot of paint and not so much water, and then start adjusting the ratio of paint to waters to where it goes on one end is going to be lots of paint, not as much water, and on the other end, lots of water, not as much paint. And what you're going to see is how many different shades you can create from one color of watercolors, how many different saturations, dark to light. By messing with this, by taking your paints and experimenting this way, you'll get to know how water and your paint interact with each other, which is going to be something that will help your confidence when you start messing with them and actually trying to paint subjects later on. Now, there are many different strokes that you can use in watercolor, but ultimately what we're going to look at are some of the most commonly used ones so that you can start experimenting with them. First is wet in wet. Now, what that means is that you're taking a wet surface and applying wet paint to the wet surface. This creates a soft look. It's a way to fill in things. You can put down water and then start painting into the water to really blow out the color and really desaturate it. You can have a wet one color and then go in with a different color and start painting that way. Wet in wet is a little bit more difficult to control, but it can create some of the softest, prettiest things. The polar opposite of wet in wet is dry brush. Now with dry brush, you take a paint that's already wet, so it's already like kind of woken up. You take your brush where you have dampened it and then kind of toweled it off so that it's got a little bit of moisture to it, but it's not very wet at all. And then you use that paint. It shows the texture of the paper through it. This works better on cold pressed paper. Again, something we talked about in the previous video, but using the dry brush is a way to get some really scratchy, interesting textures up on your paper. Next, we have blooming and bleeding. Both of these have to do with working with a lot of water and paint. With blooming, if you take a surface that you've already painted with a color or whatever, whether it's a wash or something else, if you splatter other water on top of it, what it will do is create these little like blooms. Little like flowers, little cauliflowers, sometimes people call them. Drop the water on here and it kind of splashes outwards and creates a really soft effect. Bleeding is the other side of that. With bleeding, you take paper and you get it super wet, and then you take color and you touch it to the water, and the paint's gonna go where it feels like going. And you can drag your paint brush through the water. You can tap it in, which is what I like to do. Anywhere you feel like you want that extra color, you can use your brush to manipulate the bleed and send it kind of where you want it to go. You can pick up the paper and tilt it around to make the water and the paint run. This is really where the paint goes where the water is. Sometimes it's hard to control this. Often it's hard to control this, but you can come up with some really gorgeous things if you're willing to experiment. And I really hope that you come out of this wanting to experiment, because that's the best part about watercolor. The last thing I'm going to talk about is lifting. When you've laid down paint, if you take a paper towel and scrunch it up and then use it to press and pull up some of the paint, that's how you can create some gorgeous clouds or just soft like effects where you've lightened the paint up in some spots. And it's something you can experiment with different textures. You can use a regular towel, paper, anything that you want. Lifting is a lot of fun to play with. Now, those are some of my favorite techniques to use in watercoloring. There are a whole bunch more that we're going to talk about in a later video. I would call them like the next level things, playing with salt, playing with scratches, playing with resist. All of those things we'll talk about coming up soon. But for right now, I want you to take your paints, take some water, experiment with all of these strokes and see if you can get the feel of how the paint and the water work together, build your confidence, and really start to understand it so that you can start messing around. So let me know any questions you have about watercolors down in the comments. Is this something you're intimidated by? Is there something you really want to know specifically? Let me know so that I can think about it for the next upcoming Watercolor for Noobs episodes. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time.